In the year 1925, a stray dog wandered into a quiet street in Greece, and within days 2 nations were on the brink of war. Soldiers mobilized. Borders closed. Artillery was prepared. People died. The cause of the conflict? A dog chasing its owner across a line on the ground. History remembers grand wars, conflicts born from ideology, empire, and survival. But scattered across the timeline of humanity are wars so bizarre, so strangely triggered, that they feel almost impossible to believe. Wars started by pastries, by buckets, by the disappearance of a single human ear. These were not legends. They were real conflicts that mobilized armies, shattered cities, and reshaped politics, all sparked by moments that, at first glance, seem absurdly small. To understand these strange wars, we must travel back to a border in the rugged mountains between Greece and Bulgaria in October 1925. A Greek soldier stationed near the frontier lost control of his dog. The animal darted across the demarcation line into Bulgarian territory. The soldier followed. Within seconds, a Bulgarian guard opened fire. The Greek soldier collapsed dead. What followed next unfolded with terrifying speed. Greece accused Bulgaria of murder. Bulgaria insisted the shooting was a border misunderstanding. But anger spreads faster than reason. Greek forces crossed the border in retaliation. Bulgarian villages were shelled. Civilians fled into forests and mountains. For 10 days, 2 entire countries fought a conflict that began with a dog chasing a scent. Historians would later call it the War of the Stray Dog. But this was far from the strangest example. Nearly 2 centuries earlier, in 1730, a violent conflict erupted between the Italian city-states of Modena and Bologna. The cause was not territory, nor religion, nor dynastic rivalry, although those tensions simmered beneath the surface. The official trigger was a wooden bucket. According to records, Modenese soldiers raided Bologna and stole a bucket from a city well. Bologna demanded its return. Modena refused. Soon, thousands of soldiers were marching to war over what became known as the War of the Bucket. More than 2,000 men died in the battle that followed. The bucket still exists today, displayed in Modena like a trophy of absurd history. And perhaps most famous of all was a war that began with something even stranger, a severed human ear. In 1731, a British sea captain named Robert Jenkins claimed that Spanish coast guards had cut off his ear during a confrontation in the Caribbean. Years later, he reportedly presented the preserved ear to the British Parliament as evidence of Spanish brutality. The result? Outrage. Political fury. And eventually a massive international conflict known as the War of Jenkins' Ear. Tens of thousands would die in a war triggered, at least symbolically, by a single mutilated ear. At first glance, these stories sound ridiculous. How could entire nations plunge into war over such trivial incidents? But historians know something unsettling. The true cause of these wars was never the dog, the bucket, or the ear. Those were merely sparks. Beneath them were deeper tensions, rivalries, and fears waiting for the smallest excuse to ignite. Which raises a disturbing question about human history. If wars this destructive can begin with something this small, what hidden pressures are building in the world right now, waiting for their own spark? At first glance, these strange wars look like historical accidents, moments where human irrationality simply spiraled out of control. But when historians dig deeper, a very different picture begins to emerge. Wars rarely start because of the event that appears in history books. Instead, they begin long before that moment, quietly, invisibly, beneath the surface of politics, fear, pride, and power. The dog crossing a border did not cause the Greco-Bulgarian conflict. The bucket did not truly cause the battle between Modena and Bologna. And Robert Jenkins' severed ear was not the real reason Britain went to war with Spain. These bizarre incidents were merely ignition points, tiny sparks falling onto landscapes already soaked in fuel. Take the so-called War of the Stray Dog between Greece and Bulgaria in 1925. On paper, it looks absurd. A dog crosses a border, a soldier follows, a gunshot rings out, and suddenly armies are mobilizing. But that border had already been one of the most unstable regions in Europe. Only a few years earlier, the Balkan Wars and World War I had reshaped the map of southeastern Europe. Entire populations had been displaced. Borders were redrawn by diplomats who had never walked the land they divided. Greek and Bulgarian forces had clashed before. Suspicion was constant. Soldiers stood watch not just against enemies, but against humiliation. When the Greek soldier was shot, the incident tapped directly into a reservoir of unresolved anger. In volatile systems like this, even the smallest disturbance can trigger a chain reaction. This pattern appears again and again in history. Consider the War of Jenkins' Ear in the 18th century. Britain and Spain were already locked in a struggle for control of global trade routes stretching from the Caribbean to South America. Spanish authorities frequently boarded British ships suspected of smuggling. British merchants accused Spain of brutality and harassment. Tensions simmered for years in the halls of Parliament and across the Atlantic Ocean. When Captain Jenkins presented his severed ear to lawmakers, whether literally or symbolically, it became the perfect emotional trigger. The ear was not the cause of war. It was the story that turned simmering rivalry into explosive public outrage. The War of the Bucket followed a similar pattern. Medieval Italian city-states were fiercely competitive political entities. Cities like Bologna and Modena were aligned with rival factions known as the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, two political camps that had divided Italy for centuries. The stolen bucket was not important in itself, but it represented humiliation. In societies built on honor and reputation, symbolic insults could carry enormous weight. When the bucket was taken, it became a matter of pride. Returning it would mean submission. Refusing meant war. What historians have discovered is that human conflict often behaves like a geological fault line. For years, sometimes decades, pressure builds silently underground. Political tensions, economic competition, cultural mistrust, national pride. None of these forces are visible in a single dramatic moment. But when pressure reaches a critical point, the system becomes dangerously unstable. Then, one small event, a dog crossing a border, a stolen object, a mutilated ear, can trigger an eruption powerful enough to move armies and change history. And once that eruption begins, something even stranger happens. The original cause quickly becomes irrelevant. Leaders begin fighting not for the dog, the bucket, or the ear, but for something far deeper: pride, power, and survival. The spark disappears into the fire it created, which leads to a darker realization. If history's strangest wars were not truly about the absurd events that triggered them, then the real mystery is not why those wars started. The real mystery is how often humanity has been standing on the edge of the same invisible fault line without realizing it. When we step back and look across the centuries, a disturbing pattern begins to appear. The strangest wars in history reveal something profound about human civilization. Not just that conflicts can start from trivial incidents, but that entire societies can become so tense, so emotionally charged, that almost anything can ignite them. A dog, a bucket, an ear. These objects were never powerful on their own. Their true power came from the fragile systems surrounding them. And when those systems reached a breaking point, the spark did not need to be rational. It only needed to exist. History is filled with these dangerous moments of instability. In fact, one of the largest wars in human history, World War I, was triggered by an event that, on its own, might have seemed small compared to the global catastrophe that followed. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo was shocking, but assassinations of political figures had happened many times before. What made this moment different was the immense tension that had built across Europe: rival empires, complex military alliances, rising nationalism, and an arms race that had turned the continent into a powder keg. When the gunshots echoed through Sarajevo in 1914, they did not just kill a prince. They activated a chain reaction across alliances so tightly wound that within weeks, the entire world was at war. This reveals something unsettling about the structure of human conflict. Wars often begin not because leaders want them, but because systems become too rigid to stop them. Alliances demand loyalty. Political leaders fear appearing weak. Military plans, once activated, become difficult to reverse. In such environments, the initial spark almost disappears from the story. The machinery of conflict takes over. What began as a minor incident becomes a tidal wave of consequences no one can easily control. And this raises a chilling question about the present. Modern civilization is more interconnected than at any point in history. Nations are tied together through global trade, technology networks, financial systems, and military alliances that span continents. The same forces that stabilize the world can also create enormous pressure beneath the surface. Political tensions between nuclear powers, territorial disputes over small islands or invisible borders, cyber attacks whose origins remain uncertain. In such a complex system, historians know something we often forget: the next global crisis may not begin with something dramatic. It might begin with something that seems trivial at first. A misinterpreted radar signal, a drone crossing the wrong airspace, a naval patrol encountering another ship in disputed waters. In a world where weapons can travel across continents in minutes, the spark required to ignite catastrophe may be smaller than ever before. But the strangest wars of history also offer a deeper lesson about the human mind itself. They reveal how pride, fear, and identity can transform symbols into forces powerful enough to move nations. A bucket becomes a matter of honor. An ear becomes a symbol of injustice. A border becomes a line worth dying for. Civilizations often believe they are rational. But beneath the surface, humans are creatures of emotion, story, and meaning. We fight not only over resources or territory, but over what those things represent. And perhaps that is the most haunting truth hidden inside history's strangest wars. The sparks that ignite them may be absurd, but the forces that make them burn have always been deeply human.